dive deep into the glorious yet little-known reign of King Tenkamenin of the ancient Ghana Empire. Called the Prince of Gold, his kingdom overflowed with gold, ivory, and treasures drawn from trans-Saharan trade. But that's just the surface. Tenkamenin was equally famous for his justice, his honor code, and the fairness he brought to governance. In this documentary-style video, we explore his rise, his rule, his policies, and how he balanced immense wealth with moral duty. Discover how one man shaped history, trade, and justice in medieval West Africa, and why his legacy still sparkles today. The sun rose over the savannah, casting molten light across the dusty trails where caravans once thundered through with gold, salt, and stories. Long before the name Ghana would echo across continents, there existed an ancient land spoken of in whispered reverence, Ouagadougou. Nestled between the sun-scorched Sahara to the north and the lush, resource-rich forests to the south, Ouagadougou was more than geography. It was destiny waiting to unfold. This realm, born of rivers, trade, and time, would grow to become one of Africa's first great empires, an empire that would glitter in the annals of history, built not just on gold, but on governance, power, and the moral clarity of kings like Tenkamenin. In the beginning, Ouagadougou's people were nomads, farmers, and traders. They lived close to the land, understanding its rhythms. Over time, villages gave way to towns, alliances formed, and a network of early states emerged, woven together by necessity, opportunity, and ambition. The strategic position of Ouagadougou allowed it to serve as the perfect link between the salt-rich deserts of the Sahara and the gold-laden forests of the south. From this natural crossroad, a trading culture bloomed. Merchants carried more than just commodities. They carried belief systems, technologies, languages, and tales from distant lands. It was through these cultural currents that Ouagadougou transformed into the Ghana Empire. The seeds of empire were sown in earth but watered by trade. Salt, more valuable than gold in many parts of the ancient world, arrived on camelback from the heart of the Sahara. Gold, mined from riverbeds and hills near the empire's southern frontier, glimmered in pouches slung from belts of traders. Ivory tusks, rich textiles, beads, kola nuts, everything had its market. Ghana's rulers, understanding the wealth in connectivity, imposed taxes on every caravan that passed through their domain. This wasn't exploitation, it was organization. In return, they offered safety, infrastructure, and a system of regulated trade. At a time when banditry and chaos plagued many regions, Ghana stood as an island of security. But no kingdom thrives on commerce alone. The rise of Ouagadougou was equally spiritual and intellectual. While the ruling class preserved their traditional beliefs, they welcomed Muslim traders and scholars from the north. These newcomers brought more than goods. They introduced Arabic script, new legal frameworks, and the moral and philosophical codes of Islam. Two cultures intertwined, forming a dynamic synthesis. In the capital city of Kumbi Saleh, this duality was vivid. The city itself was split in two, one half bustling with native traditions and the royal court, the other thrumming with mosques, Arabic libraries, and markets run by Muslim merchants. It was a meeting of worlds and a testament to Ghana's tolerance and pragmatism. Oral tradition speaks of heroic kings and divine ancestors, but it is through Arab geographers like al-Bakri that we glimpse the Ghana Empire's grandeur. Writing in the 11th century, al-Bakri describes an empire of immense wealth, with a king who ruled in dazzling splendor. He wore golden jewelry, surrounded himself with dogs adorned in gold collars, and governed from a palace built with sophistication and order. But even in this dazzling picture, the beating heart of Ouagadougou was not vanity, it was justice, a sense of duty bound ruler to subject gold to governance. It was this balance that would define Tenkamenin's reign. Before Tenkamenin, the rulers of Ghana, often titled simply Ghana, meaning warrior king, built their power through alliances, military might, and control over the vital arteries of trade. Their influence stretched over vast territories, and vassal chiefs paid tribute in return for autonomy and protection. These earlier kings laid the administrative and economic foundation upon which Tenkamenin would later build his legacy. They consolidated wealth but also centralized power, gradually transforming the kingdom from a loose federation into a full-fledged empire. Yet even as the empire flourished, cracks formed beneath the surface. Trade routes were shifting. Rival powers from the Maghreb, the Almoravids in particular, looked southward with ambition and religious zeal. Internally, tensions simmered between traditionalists and Muslim factions. Environmental pressures, particularly desertification, threatened key agricultural and trade zones. The empire needed a ruler who could walk the knife's edge between tradition and reform, between wealth and justice, between power and peace. That ruler would come in the form of Tenkamenin, a king destined to not only wear gold, but to wield it wisely. As the final years of the 10th century faded into the dawn of the 11th, Ouagadougou stood as a symbol of what Africa could be: powerful, just, and radiant. The stage was set, the players assembled, and at the heart of it all was a rising leader who would bring the full force of justice, brilliance, and benevolence to the throne. The world would soon come to know the Prince of Gold, not just for what he possessed, but for how he ruled. His name was Tenkamenin. When Tenkamenin ascended the throne around the year 1062, he inherited more than a crown. He inherited a delicate balance of power, wealth, and expectation. The Ghana Empire stood as a beacon of prosperity, but beneath its glittering exterior were currents of change and unease. His predecessor had ruled with strength, but the pressures of trade rivalries, growing Islamic influence, and internal divisions were mounting. Tenkamenin, though still young, stepped into the role with a vision that would fuse continuity and reform. He would not only uphold the empire's grandeur, he would deepen its moral foundation. His rise to power was not accidental. Oral traditions suggest he was groomed for leadership from an early age, steeped in both indigenous statecraft and the growing influence of Islamic political theory. Unlike many monarchs, Tenkamenin did not rule from a place of detachment. He held public audiences frequently, daily by some accounts, where subjects could air grievances, settle disputes, or seek royal advice. He made himself accessible not just as a ruler, but as a moral anchor for the people. Justice, he believed, must be visible, immediate, and impartial, no matter how rich or poor the petitioner. Within his first years, he transformed the royal court into a symbol of order. Gold, ivory, and fine textiles adorned his throne room, not just as signs of wealth, but as proof of a well-regulated trade system. His palace guards were said to wear ornaments of gold, his dogs collared with golden necklaces. But this was not opulence for its own sake. It was the performance of power, a language understood by rival kings and foreign traders alike. The court was a political stage, and Tenkamenin knew how to play his role with both splendor and humility. One of his first major acts was reorganizing the administrative system. He appointed trusted governors to oversee far-off provinces, many of whom were selected not by family ties but by merit. These governors were required to report back regularly, ensuring local rulers didn't grow too autonomous. Simultaneously, he encouraged Muslim scholars and merchants to maintain their roles in the empire, but carefully regulated their influence in legal and religious matters. Tenkamenin walked a fine line, preserving traditional beliefs while recognizing the benefits of Islamic scholarship, diplomacy, and trade connections. Diplomatically, he expanded Ghana's influence without unnecessary war. His strategy was simple but brilliant: economic dependency. He ensured neighboring territories were tied into Ghana's wealth through trade, infrastructure, and political intermarriage. Rather than provoke open conflict, he flooded rival regions with the benefits of being under his economic umbrella. Through this, he extended Ghana's influence deep into West Africa without drawing a single sword. Peace was his weapon, prosperity was his shield, but perhaps his most important achievement in these early years was invisible: trust. Under his leadership, citizens and traders alike came to believe not just in the power of Ghana, but in the righteousness of its king. Tenkamenin was not feared, he was revered. His ability to embody both authority and moral clarity would come to define his reign and lay the groundwork for a golden age that would dazzle the world. The heartbeat of Tenkamenin's empire pulsed through the trade routes, arteries of dust and ambition that stretched from the edge of the Atlantic across scorching Saharan dunes to the Mediterranean metropolises of North Africa. But it wasn't just the flow of goods that made Ghana wealthy. It was the king's strategic genius in regulating, taxing, and expanding that flow with surgical precision. Under Tenkamenin, Ghana became the epicenter of a transcontinental trade network, and its wealth didn't just sparkle, it roared. Gold was the soul of the empire. Dug from the depths of Bambouk and Wangara, it was gathered in nuggets, sifted from riverbeds, and packed in baskets. Unlike most kingdoms, Ghana had a bold policy. All gold nuggets found belonged to the king. Common people could only trade in gold dust. This ensured that Tenkamenin controlled the vast majority of the empire's wealth, maintaining both economic dominance and political stability. By controlling the source and volume of gold in circulation, he could avoid inflation, manipulate trade values, and protect Ghana's reputation as a land of limitless treasure. The other great commodity was salt, as vital as gold, if not more. Salt was a preservative, a medical treatment, a spiritual tool, and a daily necessity. It came in slabs carried on camelback through the Sahara from Tagaza and other desert mines. Salt caravans often traveled for weeks across brutal terrain to reach Ghana's markets, and when they arrived, they paid taxes, heavy ones. One tax when they entered the empire and another when they left. These levies filled the royal coffers, funding not only opulent courts but also roads, military escorts for caravans, and a functioning judicial system. Ivory, another staple of the empire's wealth, was in high demand across North Africa and the Middle East. Ghana's proximity to elephant-rich forests gave it access to an almost inexhaustible supply. Carved tusks, ivory ornaments, and uncut raw material made their way north in exchange for textiles, weapons, horses, and luxury goods. Tenkamenin established designated trading cities, each with multilingual interpreters, regulated exchange rates, and royal overseers who ensured fairness and prevented fraud. This created a business climate that drew traders from across the Islamic world. Perhaps Tenkamenin's greatest innovation was his honor-based trade system. In some parts of the empire, silent bartering was still used, a testament to both cultural diversity and the king's diplomatic agility. In this method, goods were left at a designated site, and the buyer placed gold dust beside them as payment, without either party speaking. If the seller accepted, they took the gold and left. If not, they left the goods untouched. This required an enormous level of trust and a brutally enforced punishment system for theft. And yet, it worked. It worked because Tenkamenin's name stood for honesty, and the fear of royal justice was enough to ensure compliance. While many rulers might have drowned in decadence, Tenkamenin funneled this wealth into statecraft. He invested in infrastructure, building roads, market towns, and rest stops for caravans. He hired scribes to keep records of trade, customs, and legal disputes. He brought in foreign engineers and scholars to enhance agricultural techniques and introduce new systems of taxation. Under his rule, Ghana's economy wasn't just rich, it was intelligent. By the mid-11th century, Ghana under Tenkamenin was not merely a kingdom with gold. It was the gold standard of West African commerce. Wealth poured in, not only because of what Ghana had, but because of how it was managed. Trade was not left to chance. It was law, ritual, and ideology. Tenkamenin turned economics into empire and gold into greatness. The court of King Tenkamenin wasn't merely a seat of power. It was a spectacle. A meticulously crafted display of wealth, discipline, and spiritual authority that left foreign emissaries stunned and local subjects in reverent awe. Every object, every gesture, every protocol in the royal court was curated to communicate one thing. This king does not rule by chance. He rules by divine order and absolute command. The court was the face of the empire, and Tenkamenin made it unforgettable. Al-Bakri, the famed 11th century Arab geographer, never visited Ghana himself, but relied on the detailed reports of travelers and traders who had seen it with their own eyes. They spoke of a king who emerged daily in public ceremonies flanked by dogs with gold collars, under canopies adorned with rich silks and feathers. He sat on a golden throne surrounded by armed guards dressed in brocaded tunics, each one holding a gold or ivory-tipped spear. The air was thick with incense chants and the rhythmic pounding of ceremonial drums, symbols of power that resonated deep in the bones of all who heard them. And yet, amidst this opulence, Tenkamenin's rituals were not for self-glorification alone. They were acts of governance. Every morning he held court sessions, where citizens could bring grievances directly to him. No barrier separated him from the people. Petitions were heard, disputes settled, and judgments passed with clarity and finality. These daily audiences weren't performative, they were practical. In a time when many kings ruled from shadows and distance, Tenkamenin was present physically and morally. His justice wasn't handed down, it was lived in real time. The rituals of the court also blended traditional spiritualism with Islamic influence. While Tenkamenin remained rooted in the religious customs of his ancestors, he welcomed Islamic scholars and incorporated some of their administrative models. The court calendar included both local rites and Islamic observances, creating a pluralistic system that satisfied both traditionalists and the growing Muslim merchant class. This fusion was evident in everything from dress codes to legal debates, to the architecture of court buildings. Harmony wasn't merely tolerated, it was codified. Within the palace compound, art and symbolism told their own stories. Walls were engraved with motifs of lions, the sun, and geometric patterns. Golden masks and ivory carvings depicted ancestral figures and divine protectors. Musicians played stringed instruments and drums during royal events, their rhythms not only entertaining but invoking historical memory and legitimacy. Oral poets or griots recited lineages, victories, and moral lessons, reinforcing the king's link to history and divinity. The court was a classroom, a theater, a cathedral, all rolled into one. But the ultimate brilliance of Tenkamenin's court was its functionality. Beneath the dazzling surface was a system that ran like clockwork. Scribes who documented treaties and judgments, treasurers who tracked taxes and trade income, royal messengers who carried commands to distant provinces, guards who enforced order with absolute discipline. His court was not only about the symbolism of kingship, it was a bureaucratic engine, fine-tuned to keep an empire running. Tenkamenin's genius wasn't just in what people saw, but in what they didn't. the invisible gears of governance that turned behind the scenes. In this radiant, golden theater of power, Tenkamenin did more than rule. He mesmerized. His court stood as a living statement of what a king could be, not a tyrant, not a figurehead, but a sovereign whose wealth served wisdom, whose rituals embodied justice, and whose presence shaped the destiny of a people. Gold may have filled Tenkamenin's coffers, but it was justice that filled his legacy. More than any jewel or throne, it was his commitment to fairness, law, and moral duty that earned him the awe and respect of his people, and the recognition of foreign scholars. In an age where kings often ruled by fear, Tenkamenin ruled by principle. His justice system was not just admired, it became the gold standard by which others were measured. Each day the king set aside time to hear the people, not nobles, not merchants, the people. Commoners with disputes, traders with grievances, mothers seeking restitution, and laborers demanding fairness, all had access to the king's audience. This wasn't a formality. It was an ironclad tradition. Regardless of status or wealth, if a citizen had a case, they were entitled to the ear of the king. These public court sessions were held in the open, often accompanied by musicians and griots who bore witness, reciting events and lineage with frightening precision. Justice here was a performance, but a sacred one. Tenkamenin's law was rooted in a mix of traditional Ghanaian customs and elements of Islamic legal thought, adapted to suit the realities of a diverse and expansive empire. Tribal laws, oral traditions, and community consensus formed the basis for dispute resolution, especially in rural areas. But in urban centers and royal courts, Islamic judges, qadis, were sometimes consulted, especially on trade and commercial matters involving Muslim merchants. The result was a blended legal system that was both flexible and respected, ensuring continuity while also adapting to the growing complexity of the empire. What set Tenkamenin apart was not just his accessibility, but his incorruptibility. He refused bribes, punished favoritism, and made public examples of officials who abused power. One oral account tells of a governor who unjustly seized land from a farming family. When word reached the court, Tenkamenin did not delay. He stripped the governor of his title, returned the land, and publicly apologized to the family, a move that shocked the nobility but electrified the common folk. Justice wasn't just a system, it was the king's personal mission. Punishments under his rule were severe but proportional. Theft of gold or trade goods could result in fines or forced labor. Violent crimes brought exile or, in rare cases, execution. But perhaps most revolutionary was Tenkamenin's use of restitution. If someone was wronged, the guilty party was required to make it right, not only to the victim but to the community. He understood that justice wasn't only about deterrence, but restoration. His system didn't just prevent crime, it healed the wounds left behind. Tenkamenin's commitment to justice extended beyond his borders. He worked to protect foreign merchants, especially Muslim traders who were vulnerable to exploitation in unfamiliar lands. He ensured that they were given fair treatment, translators, and access to local courts. This diplomatic courtesy solidified Ghana's status as a safe and reputable hub in the trans-Saharan trade network. Trust flowed like currency, and Tenkamenin ensured it never devalued. For centuries after his reign, Tenkamenin was remembered not just as a wealthy king, but as a righteous one. His name became synonymous with fairness, his court the model of moral governance. He proved that leadership was not about dominance but responsibility. In a world glittering with gold, Tenkamenin chose to be known for something far more enduring: justice. No empire glows forever without casting shadows. For all of Tenkamenin's wisdom, justice, and brilliance, the Ghana Empire was not immune to the tremors of change and conflict. Behind the dazzling court and booming trade routes, tensions, old and new, were beginning to crack the golden foundation. Tenkamenin stood at the crossroads of prosperity and peril, tested not just by enemies but by the very forces that helped build his kingdom: trade, faith, climate, and power. The most immediate threat came from the north, the rising wave of religious fervor sweeping through the Sahara. The Almoravids, a militant Berber Islamic movement, had begun consolidating power across North Africa. Unlike the peaceful Muslim traders who had long coexisted within Ghana's markets, the Almoravids believed in religious reform through conquest. They viewed the tolerance of kings like Tenkamenin, who allowed traditional spiritual practices alongside Islam, as heresy. In their eyes, Ghana was a wealthy but pagan state, ripe for both religious conversion and economic domination. Their ambitions were not philosophical alone. The Almoravids coveted control of the trans-Saharan trade routes. Ghana's wealth, its gold, salt, and ivory, was legendary, and its central location made it the linchpin of the entire north-south trading corridor. Capturing Ghana meant capturing the beating heart of West African commerce. Though Tenkamenin maintained diplomatic communication, it became increasingly clear that this was not a neighbor seeking friendship. It was a storm preparing to strike. Internally, the religious tensions mirrored those outside. A growing Muslim population, especially in trading towns, began to push for more Islamic influence in governance. While many supported Tenkamenin's balanced policies, others saw his dual religious approach as outdated. This created ideological fractures: traditional chiefs clinging to ancestral customs, Islamic scholars pushing for stricter reforms, and the king walking the tightrope in between. Managing these competing visions while maintaining stability demanded every ounce of his political genius. Environmental pressures also began to take a toll. Desertification, the slow and relentless expansion of the Sahara, began choking off key grazing and farming zones. Rainfall patterns shifted, wells dried, and agriculture struggled. With reduced productivity came higher food prices and social unrest, especially among rural populations. Trade, once the lifeblood of the empire, now depended on longer and more dangerous routes. Caravans faced harsher conditions, and banditry increased in the empire's outer territories. Tenkamenin responded with resolve. He reinforced military outposts near key routes, expanded diplomatic marriages with rival chiefs to strengthen alliances, and initiated irrigation projects to counteract the growing aridity. But the scale of the problem was larger than any single king. As challenges multiplied, so did doubts. Some vassal regions began asserting more autonomy. The emperor's grip, once ironclad, was beginning to loosen at the edges. Then came the real blow. Around the late 1070s, the Almoravids, emboldened and relentless, launched a military campaign into Ghana. Accounts vary. Some say Kumbi Saleh was sacked, others that the city was captured and briefly occupied. But one thing is clear: the symbolic power of Ghana was shaken. Though the empire did not collapse immediately, the illusion of invincibility was gone. Tenkamenin, already in the twilight of his reign, faced the bitter truth of history. Even the most just ruler cannot outlast the weight of time and shifting tides. And yet, in the face of these pressures, Tenkamenin did not retreat into fear or tyranny. He maintained his court, continued to hear grievances, and upheld justice. His final years were not marked by desperation, but by dignity. If Ghana's golden age was waning, it would do so with its king still standing, still listening, still judging fairly. Every golden age casts a long shadow, and for the Ghana Empire, that shadow came with painful inevitability. Tenkamenin's reign, though marked by prosperity, justice, and brilliance, could not withstand the convergence of challenges that gathered in its final years. As his leadership aged, the empire itself entered a time of transformation, not an instant fall, but a slow unraveling of the vast fabric he had so carefully woven. The Almoravid invasion around 1076 was not just a military event. It was a rupture. Even if Kumbi Saleh was not completely destroyed, its symbolic and economic foundations were deeply shaken. Trade routes were disrupted, confidence among foreign merchants waned, and the capital's status as an invincible center of wealth and power began to erode. Some Muslim communities welcomed the Almoravid influence, but many others, especially traditionalists, saw it as an occupation, not a reformation. The empire's cohesion frayed as regional chiefs began to assert more independence. Religious tensions deepened in the aftermath. The carefully balanced duality that Tenkamenin had cultivated between traditional African spirituality and Islamic pragmatism became increasingly untenable. In regions where Islamic influence intensified, older beliefs were suppressed. In response, conservative factions pushed back, sparking internal strife. What had once been a strength, Ghana's cultural plurality, now became a battlefield of identity and control. Without a strong central figure to maintain the balance, ideological fault lines became political fractures. Economically, the empire no longer held a monopoly on trans-Saharan trade. Rival states and city-states rose to prominence. The city of Gao, further east, grew in stature. Soon, so did Timbuktu. The Malinka people to the south, once tributaries of Ghana, began to form their own alliances and trading routes, bypassing the old centers of power. Salt caravans shifted, gold mines changed hands, and new trade centers emerged. Ghana, once the beating heart of West African commerce, now found itself outflanked. Nature, too, was unkind. Ongoing climate shifts worsened soil conditions, reducing agricultural output. As food production faltered, local economies suffered. Communities that once thrived on trade now struggled to feed themselves. Famine, unrest, and disease crept into the picture. These weren't apocalyptic plagues. They were subtle erosions, each one carving away at the stability that had underpinned Tenkamenin's rule. By the early 12th century, Ghana was no longer the mighty empire of the past. It splintered into smaller kingdoms and chiefdoms, many of which retained echoes of its former glory, but none of its unity. The Malinka, under a brilliant leader named Sundiata Keita, would rise from this fragmentation to build the Mali Empire, one that would eventually eclipse Ghana in wealth, size, and fame. Yet even Mali carried the DNA of Tenkamenin's Ghana: trade-based wealth, centralized justice, and strategic religious balance. Tenkamenin himself passed away not in exile or disgrace, but in dignity. Oral traditions claim that even in his final days he continued to receive petitions from his people, his voice calm, his judgment clear. He did not preside over Ghana's fall. He presided over its transformation. Like a great tree whose branches must die to feed the soil, Tenkamenin's legacy nourished the rise of new powers, new ideas, and new futures. And so Ghana faded, not into oblivion, but into history. Not every empire ends in flame. Some dissolve like gold dust into the rivers of time, leaving behind traces, myths, and lessons. And at the heart of Ghana's story, even in decline, stood a king who had turned wealth into wisdom and power into justice. In the scrolls of history, many kings are remembered for what they conquered. Few are remembered for what they protected, fewer still for what they inspired. Tenkamenin, the golden king of the Ghana Empire, was one of those rare rulers whose name outlasted his throne, not because of the land he ruled, but because of the justice he embodied. His story, though rooted in the sands of 11th century West Africa, echoes forward with lessons that are as urgent now as they were 1,000 years ago. His commitment to accessibility remains radical. In an era when modern leaders often insulate themselves behind gates, security, and bureaucracy, Tenkamenin opened his court to all. He understood that the strength of a kingdom lies not in the fear it commands, but in the trust it earns. Today, his example challenges us to rethink leadership, not as dominance but as stewardship, not as a show of might, but as a duty to serve. His balanced embrace of tradition and reform is another legacy often overlooked. Tenkamenin didn't reject Islam, nor did he suppress indigenous belief systems. He found space for both, allowing his empire to grow through inclusion rather than force. In a world still torn by ideological extremism and cultural division, his governance model stands as a template for pluralism, coexistence not by dilution but by mutual respect. Economically, his legacy is dazzling. The systems he built, from taxation to trade regulation to silent bartering, reveal a sophisticated understanding of macroeconomics, long before formal economics had a name. His ability to turn Ghana into a trusted trade hub, even among foreign merchants with different languages, laws, and faiths, shows that wealth is not just a matter of resources, but of integrity. Trust, once again, was the currency that made gold flow. But perhaps his greatest gift was his understanding of justice. Tenkamenin ruled with fairness, not because it was politically convenient, but because it was morally necessary. He recognized that the foundation of any stable society is not fear or wealth, but equity. His personal attention to court cases, his refusal to tolerate corruption, and his insistence on restitution over revenge speak volumes about the values that made his reign endure in the memory of his people. Today, the name Tenkamenin is often buried beneath layers of forgotten curriculum and Western-centric history books. But for those who uncover it, it shines as bright as the gold he once governed. Scholars of African history increasingly point to his reign as one of the clearest examples of moral statecraft in pre-colonial Africa. His story is taught in some African universities, cited in cultural preservation efforts, and spoken of by griots who still remember the rhythms of his time. But we should not let that memory stay only in books and footnotes. We should elevate it. Tenkamenin's life reminds us that greatness doesn't lie in how much a king controls, but in how justly he rules. That wealth is meaningless without wisdom, and that legacy, true legacy, isn't what you leave behind in treasure chests, but in the hearts of those who remember your fairness, your strength, and your humanity. In remembering Tenkamenin, we do more than study history. We honor it, and in doing so, we carry forward the glint of gold that can never fade. The idea that leadership, at its highest level, is the pursuit of justice wrapped in the robes of humility.